Okay, we're going to get started with our session for this afternoon, which is the future of Canada's energy and environment policy. And as you heard this morning, we discussed a lot the situation that we're currently in with respect to energy supply, energy security, and the question of the environmental impact, climate change. And we've heard about technological proposals and solutions and recommendations for Canada for dealing with the predicament that we are in. This afternoon we'll turn to discuss some of the policy implications for Canada in particular. And just yesterday, the UN Environment Programme published its Global Environmental Outlook. And this is a periodic assessment carried out by the UN, and hundreds of experts contribute to this document. And it concluded that humanity is changing the Earth's climate so fast and devouring resources so voraciously that it is poised to bequeath a ravaged planet on future generations. And the report also lamented the extremely slow and lethargic policy response to this pressing problem. And so this is a key challenge. How do we respond in a policy sense to what we know are crucial and important issues with respect to energy and the environment? And so this panel this afternoon will be discussing what Minister Lunn called this morning the 3 E's. In other words, how do we reconcile the quality of the environment, our demand for a strong economy, and also our use of energy, and not just energy that we feel we need for economic growth, but also the energy we consume on a daily basis in terms of our own individual patterns of energy consumption. And so what we've asked the panelists to discuss this afternoon is to bring forward their thoughts and ideas on what is the appropriate mix of policy tools to address this situation. What kind of mix of market mechanisms and government regulation and other sorts of tools are likely to be most appropriate, not just for reducing, in a sense, our use of energy and energy efficiency, but also thinking about our lifestyles and consumption. So with that, we've got a panel of experts who will be discussing this issue. And what I'm going to do, because we've been asked to shave a bit of time off of this session since we're starting about half an hour later than we thought we would be at this point, I'm going to introduce all of the panelists first, and then we'll just go in turn. We'll start with Professor Jack Mintz, who is a professor of business economics at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and there he is also director of the International Tax Program. And he is past president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute, and he will soon be moving to the University of Calgary in the position of the Palmer Chair in Policy Studies. Second, we'll hear from Professor Marc Jaccard, who is a professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. And Marc is a past chair and CEO of the British Columbia Utilities Commission. He has also sat on the International Panel on Climate Change. He, as well, is a leading author on the Global Energy Assessment, which is a key report coming out in a couple of years. And his book, recently published, Sustainable Fossil Fuels, was winner of the 2006 Donner Prize. And he's got a new book out as well called Hot Air. And finally, we'll hear from Daniel Schwanen, who is the Director of Research and the Chief Operating Officer here at CIGI. Daniel was previously a senior economist at the Institute for Research on Public Policy and also a senior policy analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute. And Daniel has been following issues of the interface between economy, energy, and climate change, and has written a number of editorials on this topic. And as well, I know very well Daniel's expertise because he addressed my class in environmental economics last year and spoke on this very topic. So we will start with Professor Mintz.
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to come to listen to a lot of very good discussion this morning and hearing the Secretary General of the OECD. In terms of talking about the future of Canada's energy and environmental policy, let me start with a visitation I had last week to the province of New Brunswick, in which a government got elected, actually thumping the former Conservatives, on the promise to lower the gas tax, in which the day after they got elected, they fulfilled their commitment by reducing gas taxes by 3.5 cents. In the meantime, of course, the same government, and I'm not criticizing this government particularly, but it is concerned about environmental issues. And of course, people in New Brunswick are concerned about what they can do in terms of the contribution to trying to deal with what is a significant problem for the whole world, global warming, and are looking at potential policies down the road that will deal with that. New Brunswick, in my view, is a perfect example of a very schizophrenic approach that we use in Canada towards energy and environmental policy. On one hand, we undertake a lot of policies that actually make it more difficult for us to deal with questions of the environment, and that's because governments are often asked to deal with issues like higher gasoline prices or higher power prices, and reducing those in some way, or undertaking particular policies that actually make things that more difficult. On the other hand, we also have a Canadian public that is very concerned now over environmental issues, and are certainly pushing towards having more action done. So this suggests to me that I think there's a great opportunity to try to really put these two things together, where we can both get more effective pricing, market pricing, and a removal of government intervention in energy markets that we've seen over the years, while at the same time undertake other policies that could help improve environmental pricing. And so let me say that I think there is a role for Canada to try to maximize the returns that it gets out of its resources, which is a tremendous benefit to the Canadian economy and to the Canadian public, because those resources are right across Canada, even though they might be regionally concentrated in Alberta and the western provinces. But we have to remember that Newfoundland, Nova Scotia have oil and gas resources themselves. And of course, our power is used by Canadians in general to heat their homes, to run their cars, and everything else. And so there is certainly a lot of great interest, I think, in terms of Canadians, in terms of getting the policies right, in terms of energy pricing. At the same time, we need to also think about what we can do in terms of environmental policies. And I have to admit, I've always been persuaded by Marc Jaccard's argument that really it's not a matter of reducing energy, it's a matter of trying to deal with carbon and trying to effectively reduce carbon that's being used in our processes. And in some ways, I look at Norway as a very good example for Canadians to think about policy here. The Norwegians certainly have exploited the use of their natural resources that are available to them in the North Sea, have maximized the returns that they get, but at the same time they have undertaken a number of policies to try to reduce emissions over time, and they have been successful in doing that. And so, given that Norway is very similar to Canada in being a resource-rich country, I think that there are some lessons to be learned there, and I'm sure Marc will have more to say about that. So, what do we mean by environmental and energy policy? Well, first of all, I think we need to think more about efficiency, and in particular, we should try to avoid distortions in pricing. And that means in terms of market pricing. Governments that try to, let's say, try to freeze the power rates in order to protect consumers from higher power rates. And with respect to the environment, market pricing also means trying to price those things that are not priced in the market, and in particular, harmful activity. And I do think that there is a role in terms of public policy in trying to address that. And that, of course, requires looking at particular types of interventionist tools, whether they be regulations or tax instruments, and I'll talk about that later on. Of course, part of setting any energy and environmental policy is that we have to think about fairness. And in particular, we know that sometimes some policies can have harmful effects on the poor or lower income individuals, and we have to think of ways of offsetting that. And I think in Canada we've been pretty smart in doing that in terms of the use of various types of support that are not related to energy use, or let's say the sort of thing that we're trying to stop, but let's say give refundable credits or grants to low-income people as an offset without trying to actually disturb the pricing that's associated with that. Unfortunately, not all governments have done that. And then, of course, we also have to worry about, on a fairness point of view, particularly in a country like Canada, the regional impacts, which I think are very critical, because certainly one of the things that we don't want to have is one region feeling that they are unfairly treated relative to other regions, and so therefore a comprehensive approach has to be taken to environmental and energy policy to make sure that we are treating all regions fairly in this country. And then also I think that we have to think about what's happening in the world, and in particular, probably after 2008, we'll see some changes in U.S. policy, but certainly harmonization of our policies with the United States would have to be a consideration that we would have to have. But we do have to think about our position relative to the U.S. and other countries in terms of the competitiveness of our system, and of course that must be taken into account in developing any policies. And then finally, we have to think of federal-provincial harmonization. And to give you an example on carbon taxation alone, Alberta has brought in its carbon tax. The federal government has indicated that it's going to bring in their carbon tax. Of course, we also have had recently a Quebec move in that they're trying to put a carbon tax on producers of energy, but we'll see whether that actually happens. It'll probably end up being paid for by consumers. But the main point is that how are these policies getting harmonized? Are they on top of each other? Is one an offset to the other? And certainly we need to start thinking a little bit more about the kind of harmonization that's going to be required in Canada in the future. But this is another important principle that has to be considered as part of our policy making. Now let me first of all suggest that there are two ways in which I think we could try to move to a, let's say, the zero carbon world. Whether we get there is another issue, but certainly there are some policies that could do a lot. And sometimes I like to look at policies that are currently existing that tend to cause too much carbon consumption, and also other harmful effects on the economy that we could, I think, clean up and actually have some positive impacts on some of the things that people are looking for. So, for example, when I look at regulatory policies, and I see that provinces trying to protect consumers from higher prices by regulating those prices to below costs of producing that energy. To me, that's a policy that we should rethink in terms of what its impact is on the environment, but also on the economy as well, because I think low energy prices ends up resulting in too much consumption of energy that is appropriate in terms of improving the economy's productivity. Also, we have to think more about underpricing of water. To the extent that we underprice water, then we get too much consumption of water, for example, in the agricultural sector or in other sectors as well. And of course, that makes that much ends up leading, I think, to some impacts on the environment ultimately that's not appropriate. Municipal policies can often lead to too much transportation, urban sprawl in economies, and that's where things like policies that increase density in communities could actually have some very positive effects, but then there are municipal zoning laws that tend to interfere with that. Similarly, with transportation, there could be some very positive impacts in terms of better road pricing, tolling of roads, and things like that try to shift people away from cars to other modes of transportation, or at least trying to reduce some of their demand for transportation. This is now starting to move worldwide. And yet we recently had a very large city in our country that decided on a tax revenue that's not related to consumption of transportation, when actually there are other alternatives, road pricing particularly, that could have been considered. And in fact, the city actually had said that would be the least desirable form of tax revenue, which is rather surprising to hear. And then on the taxation side, we have all sorts of incentives built in the system for what leads to what I would call negative effective tax rates in exploration and development of mining and oil and gas firms. We also have incentives for renewable energy, of which may be good, but may not be good. In fact, they often lead to higher capital good input prices, and I think we need to better understand the effectiveness of some of these incentives that we do create. And finally, we need to also think about what we are doing with fuel taxation. Now, fuel taxation at the provincial level is used to fund infrastructure, but the federal fuel excise tax really has no role. It was originally brought in to improve security of oil supply to the Canadian economy, but it really has no role outside of being a revenue grab for the federal government. And why not take the federal fuel excise tax and start thinking more of a broad-based environmental tax that could apply to different energy sources according to carbon content? That's a proposal that I think could provide some opportunities. So given that I have only a short time, let me just sum up very quickly with two important points. First of all, I think we need better market pricing, period, for energy, and I think that would be good for the energy industry particularly, and maximize the returns that we have from our energy resources that are so important to this country. At the same time, we need to undertake some environmental policies that I think would make sense, and in fact, I think we should not try to go to the perfect policy right away that's going to eliminate all carbon immediately, because I think this will take time. But put in prices that will actually create incentives, I think, to introduce technologies. Then we don't need to necessarily worry about whether it's going to be big technologies or little technologies that will get adopted. They will get adopted if you have the appropriate pricing for the environmental harm. And I think that there are a number of things to consider on terms of both taxation and regulation that will need to be considered. In fact, when you look at European reform, they originally started talking about environmental taxation. They realized that they were going to put some subsidies in the system, so then it became environmental fiscal reform. And then afterwards they realized that they were going to have to use a combination of regulations, taxes, and other things. And so it became ecological reform in Europe. And there's all sorts of exemptions given to big emitters and all sorts of other things that are done in the system. It's not a perfect system in Europe, but they have had some impact on emissions over time. And I think the most important thing today in Canada is that we start creating a mindset of creating policies that will deal with these environmental issues, and there's a whole bunch of them to consider, and I think we should start moving in a direction that deals with them. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop there, but perhaps in question period time, Marc and I might get into a bigger debate, which is more appropriate to use, regulations or taxation. I'm of the view that there's going to be a gambit of policies that are going to be used, and in fact, we're going to need to do that. And they all can have their own particular impacts on the economy, but I think that there are some things that one will have to be careful about in the development of all these policies as we try to move ahead. And I think we should try to move ahead slowly with the appropriate policies as opposed to look for the big bang at one time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mintz. We'll now hear from Professor Jaccard.
Thank you. I've been working in the area of greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable energy systems for over 2 decades, and I have been to a lot of conferences where people have discussed policies that we ought to be implementing and thinking about it. And what I find interesting sometimes is we sit in this spot right here where we talk about, okay, and what policies ought we to put into place? And I'm part of that group of people, though, who are maybe your collective memory. My job is to tell you that actually you do have policies in place, and you've had policies for a very long time. And we've, in fact, gone through this history, speaking of Canada, but a lot of this can apply to other countries. Canada seems to be particularly salient in this regard. We've gone through this process of setting ambitious targets, unveiling policies that will help to achieve those targets, and in fact our political leaders agreeing with all of us or telling us our policies will achieve those targets, and then we march along and we miss the targets, and we in fact forget about the targets and start talking about new targets. And I have an overhead that depicts that. Now, this is what our emissions have done and have continued to do, but what you should notice here is that as early as 1988, Brian Mulroney was setting targets. He set targets for 2000 for the year 2000 at the G7 meeting in 1988. Later on, he also, or at the same time, in the same year at the World Conference, our government set a target for 2005. And in Rio in '92, we reaffirmed our target for 2000. And more people are more familiar with our target for Kyoto, and we've implemented policies all the way along the line. Now, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are the natural scientists who get all the glamour, but there are also people like myself who've participated on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change who are social scientists, economists, political scientists, sociologists, and those of us who work on how do we actually get emissions to go down rather than what might be their impact. And I would argue that the findings of that group quite conclusively are what I'll call the second inconvenient truth, which is that until we get a value on the atmosphere, until there is some kind of cost or constraint on emissions to the atmosphere, those emissions won't go down. And the Canadian policy set that we've continued to use is one of, well, think of your generic categories of policies: information, subsidies, regulations, and financial sticks, like a carbon tax and so on. We have applied, all of those policy sets are actually quite similar. They are a little more intense as we got from the Green Plan to the National Action Program, the ones focused on greenhouse gases, but they all had that same element. What's interesting, though, is that that's not how it was written up. Like, at each step along the way, I've been involved in debates for 2 decades in which we agreed, yes, at the end of the day, we have to get some kind of price on emissions in a market economy to reflect the value we have in not emitting into the atmosphere. And then what's gone on, though, is politicians and the political process, let's say, in part feeding back from the public and the message they get, have said, well, actually, these policies can be treated as substitutes. Instead of those pricing and regulatory mechanisms, we can use information and subsidies. And that's left me in the position where I have to keep saying these policies have to be thought of as complements rather than as substitutes. And I'm smiling at John Helliwell, because I don't know if any of you have been trapped on an airplane for 4 hours sitting beside him debating this stuff, but I'm starting to use his language already, and that was just 2 days ago. Anyway, so yes, information and subsidies may be part of it. Very carefully designed subsidies, John, because I do a lot of work on how certain kinds of subsidies are almost completely ineffectual. But at the same time, we need to understand that these are complements, that those other policies have to be in place. Now, Jack and I have debated in writing and on other panels what those policies should look like. I'm happy to hear him say he's interested in the tax mechanisms. But he'll probably say that I'm the one who's shifting, because I'll argue that in all of the writings, I actually haven't cared which instrument we used to get the value on the atmosphere, whether it was a carbon tax, which I admit as an economist I tend to favor, some kind of cap system, which can get really tricky when you try to expand it from 700 large industrial plants in Canada to trying to make it work for all consumers, but there are ways to do that. And I've written papers and worked with other colleagues on that. Or we're talking about, let's say, what Arnold Schwarzenegger's trying to do in California, which is set up a whole bunch of very focused regulations on, here's the carbon content of fuels, here's the carbon content of electricity, here's the technology mix of cars and how that must change over time. For an economist, I can see all sorts of problems with those, but I think it's important enough now to move ahead and get a value on the atmosphere that I'm even willing to swallow hard in order to see some of that stuff implemented. And I do a fair bit of research right now on how far from efficiency some of those policies might be. So and just to give you a flavor of this, though, in 1999, after Kyoto, the government launched a process called the National Climate Change Process, and they picked the model that I have and a model of a colleague at McGill as the energy economy models that would be used to simulate the policies and actions that would reduce our emissions in order to meet the Kyoto time frame, the target for Kyoto. And when we finished, we said, well, here's either a cap or a tax, and it's got to be pretty significant, because you're talking about taking an economy that's moving this way in terms of carbon dependency and somehow shifting it down in a very short time frame when we think of capital stock turnover. And what happened is what I was just recounting to you. The government then said, well, you're pretty good modelers, and we're going to take your emissions trajectory, but we'll use the substitute policy. So we're going to do Rick Mercer commercials and labels on fridges. And so that's basically what Canada pursued. And that's the fear I have going forward, that that's exactly what's going to happen again. So I'm going to finish off my comments by just talking about some of the examples out there. Canadians like to think of ourselves as leaders, and I still hear debates about, well, should we lead in this area, because what of our competitive advantage relative to Americans if they're not doing it, and so on. And it gets a little bit funny now, because actually the train has left. We can't be leaders. Jack mentioned Norway, so that's a nice lead-in to a figure that I have on Norway, who implemented a carbon tax about 15 years ago. They're not idiots. They know about all the things that an economist would raise the flag on. The tax shouldn't be too high initially. It can't just hammer your industry. There's got to be some kind of break or negotiation with firms that are dependent on trade and on export markets and are exporting and competing against others who don't face it, other elements to it, and they put it in place nonetheless, and here's what's happened. So up above you have, of course, their greenhouse gases. This is the period 1990 to 2002. I've just gotten some data to extend this out another 3 years, and it gets even worse from a Canadian perspective than what I'm showing you there. So you want to divide it by per capita, because our population is growing faster than the Norwegians, so to be fair to us. So instead of looking at the second row there, look at the first row, and that's the greenhouse gases per capita, what's happened. But what happened to GDP per capita then? You know, what were the economic repercussions for the Norwegians of going first? Well, their GDP per capita went up faster. What about oil production, gas production? Because what we've said is that oil and gas production is what's driving our greenhouse gas emissions, and so surely that's going to have had a dampening effect on the Norwegians. And apparently not, or maybe it has had a dampening effect, but not enough to destroy the kind of growth and economic development prospects they've had from exploiting their fossil fuel resources. What it has meant is that, well, they did the policy in the way that we'd expect, price not too high, expected to increase contingent upon prices in competing jurisdictions. So, I mean, isn't that what we would do in Canada? We'd say, look, here's where it's going to go, but guess what? If your major trading partners will have some kind of adjustment here as it moves forward. Also, there were some partial exemptions for industry, not total exemptions. So, for example, the oil and gas industry paid a lower tax and was said, but to get that lower tax, we want to see you be global leaders in zero-emission uses of fossil fuels. So, who did the first major project to sequester carbon strictly for the reason of avoiding and reducing carbon taxes? The Norwegians, and they have the major project called Sleipner to bury CO2 under the North Sea. Also, it looks now, although we've talked about major subsidy programs, as we kind of had some language about that this morning for clean energy, the Norwegians now look like they'll be the first to build an electricity generating plant that is going to have carbon capture and storage. They're much further along, while other projects in the US, UK, and elsewhere have had a lot of delays on that. And finally, recycling of the tax revenue to reduce other inefficient, that Jack would love, and I'm trying to get him to start designing these things, and unpopular taxes. I want to end, I have another slide that I won't show about all the different approaches to go international with this. Maybe that'll come up in the question period. But I did want to stop with a couple of warnings here. One is that people have talked about this morning about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency without significant energy price increases will lead to greater energy use. And in any case, the world's going to be using a lot more energy, so we absolutely must get to near zero emission energy technologies. And finally, I'm nervous about a technology focus. If it's just relying on public subsidies and a few massive zero-emission technology projects, because the great danger is that governments will use their participation in these as an excuse for doing little else and not putting in those other policies that have to be there and should be there immediately in order to get the kind of effect we need 4 decades from now. It's actually that long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jaccard. We'll now hear from Daniel Schwanen.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm hopefully going to pick up. You're probably not going to hear much of a debate on this panel, from the panelists at least. I'm hopefully going to pick up where Jack left off in terms of Canada's schizophrenia, or where you started, Jack, but I'm going to expand a little bit on that, on this particular issue, why we can't seem to get our act together, quite frankly, and certainly not relative to the promises we've made. And subsequent to that, I'm going to expand a little bit, since we've had our two very distinguished economists expand on the need for pricing of carbon, pricing a cleaner atmosphere. I'm going to expand a little bit on one way that I see very promising to do that, which would be carbon allowance emissions trading. Now, yes, Canada's schizophrenia. We've performed, in terms of our emissions growth, the comparison was made with Norway. We've performed 40% worse than Germany, 40 percentage point worse in terms of our emissions, carbon emissions growth than Germany, both Germany and the UK, since 1990. 1990 is the Kyoto base year for counting the growth in emission, and every growth rate that I'm going to mention is relative to that year. And we've even performed worse than the United States, which is very intriguing because the United States refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, thinking they couldn't meet their promises. We did, thinking somehow we couldn't meet our promises, and we ended up with a much worse, well, 10% worse growth in carbon emissions than the United States. And why has that been the case? Canada has done worse in those 3 countries at reducing energy use per unit of GDP. That's one reason. But we've done particularly badly at reducing the carbon intensity of our sources of energy, whereas the United Kingdom, of course, and Germany had an opportunity to switch to much cleaner natural gas from coal. We didn't have that opportunity. In fact, we went the other way, as I'll mention in a minute. So we've been particularly bad at reducing the carbon intensity use of our sources of energy, not just energy per GDP relative to these other countries, but the carbon intensity of the sources. And even relative to the United States, we've been less aggressive in terms of alternative energy sources, nuclear, and so on. Relative to the UK and Germany, Canada has also experienced considerably stronger population growth. That alone has contributed to 10 percentage point of that 40% touch point difference in growth in emissions that I mentioned. And that's very significant. Population growth is actually a major contributor to Canada's GDP growth, to Canada's economy, and ergo to the growth in our emissions if we don't watch our energy efficiency or the carbon intensity of our emissions. What I'm trying to say really is get at the heart of this problem that we have politically relative to the promises we've made, is simply that the growth in emissions in Canada has been intimately linked to the sources of what we have experienced, which is a very prosperous economy in recent years, relative at least to what make other economies, including the 3 I mentioned, tick or not tick, as the case may be. We're talking about what had been until recently the stupendous success for an advanced economy like Canada's of our manufacturing sector, supported by tax reform, free trade, and of course a historically low Canadian dollar relative to its US counterpart until recently. More recently, many natural resources industries have done well, and most particularly our oil and gas industry, and within that most particularly our oil sands, that alone would earn Canada the energy superpower moniker that it seeks, but whose very exploitation under current techniques has been highly carbon intensive relative to conventional oil and gas. And I wonder if that's played a part in the Canada-Norway differential. But as a result of these and other factors, Canada's economy, industrial economy, the more traditional economy, I suppose, is as strong now as it was in the Kyoto base year of 1990, rather than having been significantly weakened, as has been the case in, among others, the three countries I have mentioned that have, for example, evacuated a lot of their manufacturing sector to third countries. Our industrial employment now is the same as it was during the Kyoto base year, but it's 30 to 40% lower in countries such as the UK, Germany, and the United States. And all of this has been directly linked to the growth in our emissions. As Jack mentioned, we also have a serious regional imbalance problem in that 60% or so of the growth in emissions in Canada since 1990 has taken place in Alberta and Saskatchewan combined. However, and not coincidentally, these two provinces combined have contributed to growth in federal revenues that are being distributed across the country, that are almost double their share of the population. So we all have a hand in this, I'm afraid. Now, what do we do? Our two previous speakers were extremely eloquent. We need to price carbon. We need to price the cleaner atmosphere that we require. And I'm not going to go over the arguments that they made because they made them very eloquently. However, there are two ways of doing this. One is through a carbon tax, and we've had periodically these political debates in Canada. I think a carbon tax is more acceptable in some jurisdictions than in others. In Canada, I don't think the concept, quite frankly, and here I'm switching to political economy, but has not really taken off. What's the alternative? The alternative is emissions trading, emissions under a cap and trade system. Now, why is that like a tax? Well, it forces, often in the discourse, in the debate, you hear, well, it's like giving companies or large emitters or others an allowance to pollute. But in fact, it's an allowance that is reduced over time, consistent with the long-term targets that you have over time. And if you want to exceed the target, you pay a price. If you want to, that is to say, exceed the carbon emissions that you're allowed, you must pay a price. And that price goes to those in the marketplace that have been able to reduce the emissions below, let's say, a national target or an industrial target. In other words, carbon emissions trading does put a tax on emissions or put a price on emissions, which is really the key here that our panelists have described as being maybe complementary to other measures, but absolutely necessary to being able to reduce emissions. It's not only necessary, but it's actually also very efficient. Putting a price on emissions, I'm not going to go through this, but certainly a uniform price allows the emissions to be reduced where, in fact, they are least costly to be reduced. You do have the option of not reducing, you just have to pay a price to do that. And then you have the options of reducing, and if you can do so easily more than your allotted target, you actually get compensated for that through the marketplace. So I think it's a system that has obvious advantages from the point of view of economic efficiency, and it's also a system that has a built-in incentive, just like a tax would, for continued innovation relative to, say, the regulating specific products or specific processes that are a one-off thing that you have to repeat each time. If you have a price on emissions, you constantly have an incentive to reduce them. Now, why do I like emissions trading relative to a tax, and why, obviously, I think it seems to me the Canadian government is more, and others, not every country by any means, are comfortable with emissions trading relative to a tax. I think, first of all, tax evokes the idea that you're going to have an increased sources of revenue for government, and you can make that revenue neutral by cutting taxes that are inefficient. But I'm not so sure, given a recent experience with the GST, for example, that this is the path that, for example, our government is on. And I'm personally a bit wary of saying we're just going to raise a tax, and what we're going to do with a tax are all kinds of good things, including reducing other taxes. I think there are ways, of course, unless you auction off allowances, there are ways of making, of devising an emissions trading system that does not, if you like, slosh money around back and forth from government, and I see some advantages to that, including political advantages. Emissions trading makes it easy for the public to understand the system relative to the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not to raise revenue or have taxes, but the ultimate goal is really to reduce emissions. And you can frame the emissions trading system in a way that, in a quantitative way, where you have under a cap and trade system, reduce emissions over time. And that's easy to understand in terms of the ultimate goal. It makes the political bargain easier to understand. In the words of the OECD, an intrinsic property of emissions trading is that it allows government and negotiators to focus on the acceptability, the equity of the initial allocation in both the domestic and international cases, which is hugely important, as we found out since the signature of the Kyoto Protocol. We can point out, in particular in the case of sulfur dioxide, to very successful experiments where the system has been found to be very efficacious, and that would and low cost, lower than expected costs in terms of reducing emissions, which would reassure both businesses, consumers, and environmentalists that results would actually be achieved at the lowest possible cost. Finally, quoting, not quite finally, Jennifer, but quoting a 1999 paper by Cranton and Kerr, taxes make the development of risk-sharing options equivalent to those in permit futures and options markets less flexible. Obviously, an emissions trading system would make the development of those options more flexible, easier to take place, and I see a lot of advantages to developing futures and options markets in carbon emissions. I'll get to the revealed preferences, reasons why I like emissions trading. It's happening. Carbon markets around the world are growing fast in volume and in value, with the World Bank estimating that carbon allowances traded grew from 328 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to 1.1 billion carbon dioxide tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is approximately twice of Canada's emissions total that is now being traded in these markets. Membership in the voluntary but binding Chicago Climate Exchange rose from 127 members to 237 members in the year 2006 alone. Finally, in the context where we have national governments, both in Canada and especially in the United States, that have been hesitating on the climate change front, participating in these exchanges have allowed a number of provinces and states to move ahead with their own plans more efficiently. And well, I have another list. I'll add one very last advantage, which is that to make these markets work, you need the promise of market continuity. The European example has shown that if you don't know what's happening after 2012, you have highly volatile prices, crashes and peaks and so on and so forth. And because to make the market work, you need a policy beyond 2012, it really encourages government to think about what the policy is going to be. And I think that, and actually to set it out long in advance, which I think in the Canadian case would be an immense relief and a good incentive for the government to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So the three speakers have given us their insights on how we balance the different goals and the challenges with respect to energy and environment. We'd like to now open up to the audience with some questions, and I believe there are people with microphones. We'll start with a question here. And please identify yourself and say who the question is directed toward.
Thank you. Naoki Tanaka, the Center for International Public Policy Studies in Tokyo. There is a possibility that the combination of cap and trade measures and this green development mechanism will penetrate in the global situation. So how do you think about, one, from the viewpoint of allocation of resources, second, from the viewpoint of the avoidance of global warming?
Yeah, I'm just as I talked about some of the problems with subsidy programs, and I didn't give you a lot of detail, there is a real challenge in trying to use a subsidy approach to reduce emissions in unregulated parts of the economy or unregulated parts of the world, so countries that don't have caps. And the Clean Development Mechanism tries to do that. As a way of transferring money to developing countries, it may be a good policy, but there are several researchers, myself among them, who are starting to look very closely at things like the clean development mechanism in the same way that we've looked at earlier utility subsidy policies that went on in North America, to try to really see what their additivity is, what their incremental effect is. And although people will tell you that they've set up verification mechanisms to make sure that a particular investment that someone makes somewhere else in China is actually different from the trajectory that industry was on or households, my experience as a utility regulator is that actually it's very difficult to determine that. It's a very difficult empirical statistical problem. And so I'm somewhat nervous that whether it's in a country or internationally, that we might think that that kind of approach is a solution for the longer term one, which is that each country has to have a cap, or we need some other kind of policy like an international carbon tax or regulations that are disseminated through countries. If we think that that is making progress, we may have to go 1 or 2 decades before then we'll prove and see, oh, it didn't have the effect we thought it would have. So that's a concern that I have.
Well, I just, on this, very similar to Mark, I have a lot of concern over monitoring issues, and I think that's, and there's always a problem of subsidies in that you think you're changing behavior, but you may not be, or people are taking a subsidy, but something else is happening that offsets entirely the value of the subsidy. And I think that is, I think, the difficulty. Global warming is an international problem, and I think maybe the one difference between Mark and I is the one reason I don't care for the tax solution as much as the tradable permit solution is that if you want to get international cooperation, I think the tradable permit solution is going to be where we're going to end up moving to in order to do that. And it may be that some offsetting grants are going to have to be provided by governments to other governments to implement some offsetting policies on their own. But I do think that the tradable permit is a way of actually trying to get international cooperation. On the other hand, there are some problems with the tradable permit thing, which I agree with Mark on. And part of it is it only applies often to big emitters in countries, and you end up leaving off consumers, small business who should be engaged in kinds of these actions. And so that's the reason why I think in the end you're going to use a gambit of policies in order to deal with the issues.
All right, I've been passed a note that we have to end in 10 minutes, so I've got 3 people who've had their hand up. I think what I'll do, 4 people, I will collect the questions, and then we'll allow the panelists to respond. So we'll start with a question here.
Jerry Wright from the National Electricity Roundtable. We had 3 terrific contributions this afternoon, but they were all about environmental policy. And the subject was energy and environmental policy. And I'm wondering, why is it that this is so often the case, that we have environmental policy masquerading as energy policy? Isn't the real challenge to integrate the two, and particularly with the enormous policy challenge that we have, a challenge that involves many regulatory adjustments, federal, provincial coordination, an enormous variety of dimensions, the challenge of building a huge amount of infrastructure that is going to be necessary to meet the energy demands in this country?
Okay, thanks. Next we'll hear from Roy.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Roy Culpepper, North-South Institute. I think the elephant in the room on this issue is neither energy nor carbon, but economic growth. And I think I picked up on a remark that Jennifer made in her opening statement as chair about our lifestyles. And it just strikes me that we're not really addressing this issue at all unless we address the issue of economic growth, particularly in the richest countries. And I'd like here to invoke the work of people like John Helliwell and Richard Layard, who've done some very interesting empirical work looking at the relationship between economic growth and well-being. And that work suggests that, I forget the exact numbers, but there's a very steep improvement in well-being up till, say, $10,000 or $12,000 per capita GDP. But then it levels off, and there's also some negativities, diseconomies, if you will, as countries get richer. And the diseconomies we've been talking about in this room have to do with the environment. But there are other social diseconomies as well that visit countries that get richer and richer. So my question is, why don't we talk more about why rich countries should grow without end every year at 2%, adding to all of the environmental as well as these other woes? Why do we not address this question and use some of the work of people like John Helliwell? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roy. A question right here.
Robert Lafrance, Bank of Canada. I think just a quick comment. The industrialized countries are running out of people, so we'll consume less in the future. My question has to do, I agree with the general thrust of the thing that emission trading is probably the way to go. I just wanted to get a flavor from the panel. Have we actually learned enough about emissions trading, about the problems with grandfathering, about the problems of allocating these permits, about making sure that nobody controls, like Enron, the market or something in the future? Do we know enough of this to make it work? That's my question.
Okay, thanks very much. And one final question right here, and then we'll turn it over to the panel.
Michael Small from Foreign Affairs. My question really falls directly on from that one, which was simply what can Canadians learn from the European experience with the CO2 emissions trading system that they have there? You cited one limiting factor, which is lack of continuity, but I'm sure there are other dimensions as well that are applicable for our own analysis.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll have the panelists respond to the questions. Actually, we'll go in reverse order, so we'll start with Daniel and end up with Professor Jaccard.
Sure. Yeah, certainly I think in our minds, I don't know if I can speak for the rest of the panel, but when we did speak here of environmental, in particular, I guess climate change policy, energy and energy development was never far from our minds. I think that Marc mentioned that the important thing was to reduce the carbon damage created by the current sources of use of energy, and the technology and the infrastructure that was necessary to address that was never far from my mind when I spoke of creating a market where actually you could fund some technology projects on the emissions market, which is something I've written about earlier. So I'd say that there's a very close connection between energy and environmental policy, but I think the crux of the matter is that we need to have an environmentally sound energy policy, and I think this is a little bit what we were talking about here. I can't speak for the other panelists. In terms of economic growth and well-being, well, I'd rather, instead of talking about limiting economic growth, I would rather limit economic growth if it's really damaging. So I would rather address directly and price the damage that we're doing. You mentioned social diseconomies, there are environmental externalities. I'm not so sure that we'd want to limit growth per se. I don't think that that's necessarily what you were talking about, but I don't think that that should be our objective. Certainly our objective should be quality of life, and certainly our objective should be to price the damage we're doing. And certainly there are ways of doing this in a way that minimize the economic growth or actually continue to allow the economic growth necessary to address, for example, some of the poverty issues that we still have domestically and internationally. So I don't think that we should target economic growth. In other words, that we should target damaging economic growth. In terms of the work that's been done on emissions trading, my sense, and this is just judging for the literally very high pile of papers in my office on this, but Marc can probably address this more because of his role in the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. There's been a lot of studies. This is not to say that we don't know that there are still things that we don't know, that there are still things that are very experimental. We've just went through an experiment with the European emissions trading that was very harrowing in many ways, and now that's being studied by the OECD, the World Bank, and others. There's still a lot of things that we need to learn, but I would suspect that, judging from the fast growth, including in the voluntary emissions trading market, that some people have figured out that this was a useful tool that still needs a lot of tweaking and technical analysis.
Thanks, Daniel. Professor Mintz?
You want me? Okay. First of all, just on the first question, vis-a-vis energy and environment, maybe I didn't make myself clear, but that was really the major point of my discussion, is that I think that you could have policies that would maximize the returns on our energy, and the way of doing that is to really move to, which we've done over the past number of years, but to maintain actually policies that don't interfere with pricing of energy. And the projects such as Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and others will go on under that context, because we're getting the prices right for energy, and we're not trying to interfere with the markets in that sense. And I think that's the important point to that. With respect to pricing, however, as economists always point out, is that when you don't price certain things that are not priced in markets, then it's very important to work out policies that do that. And I think that's where environmental issues come in. And if you also have some other instruments to try to deal with the environmental issues, and I think one can actually both maximize our returns from energy while at the same time achieve something on the environmental side. I don't expect a perfect world, as I pointed out, but I do think that when you look at an experience like Norway, which is similar to us in having a very large resource sector, that certainly you can do some things to try to reduce carbon production and at the same time still be able to achieve economic growth, which really gets to the second point. I'm still not convinced that economic growth is a bad thing. In fact, I would argue that people still like rising incomes, and I think in today's world, especially with industrialized nations, where you're having demographic issues, and where retired populations are going to have to depend on the productivity of economies in order to provide the kind of benefits that they need to support them, then economic growth is going to be very important in industrialized nations. And not only that, the tremendous economic growth that's now coming out of Asia, I think, cannot be ignored in the whole question of environmental issues and emissions that are coming out. China is certainly one of the big emitters. So is Russia in terms of the statistics. And I don't think that we can totally ignore these countries, or many countries that look poor now, but if they don't get their policies in place, we certainly will have a tremendous difficulty dealing with the carbon issue down the road. Finally, with respect to emission trading, my knowledge of the sulfur emission trading that went on in North America has been that it was quite successful on the whole. They seem to have dealt with a lot of the technical issues that were involved. I know that in the European context, I actually happen to know somebody who's very much involved with the trading system in Europe. Certainly one of the problems that actually for its collapse was just simply a lot of permits were passed out last year, which led to almost the price of carbon going down to zero. You'll see governments tightening up on that over this coming year, and I think it's a very young market. But all this sort of suggests to me that it's a go slow process. We've got to start with some policies. We don't expect the big bang. Let's just start moving in some directions in terms of moving in this area. And the only reason I think emission trading will be something we'll want to do is simply that I think it's going to happen in the United States, and I think because of most of their discussions are in that direction, and it's already happening in Europe. And the one thing that you could do is probably run a viable emissions trading market of Europe and North America, because I think there'd be a lot of confidence in it.
Thanks. Okay, Professor Jaccard.
I could be brief because the previous speakers talked about economic growth, energy security, which was raised as an issue, and I'm fairly similar to their positions. And also, Jack mentioned the sulfur trading program that the U.S. did, which is seen as a real example out there of a cap and trade system. And I want to point out, I'll reiterate again, I'm not necessarily an advocate that it must be carbon tax. I'll point out that there are let's not overlook some of the challenges of cap and trade. So for example, a country like the UK has both. It has a carbon levy, which affects you when you buy gasoline at the pump, small emitter, and yet it is part of the European cap and trade system for large emitters. So all sorts of hybrid policies will come out there. when we start to think about going internationally and talk about countries setting caps, we talk about this second phase of Kyoto, for example. And at least when I talk to the people involved in international negotiations, get ready for some real challenges here, because countries are still in the position they had at Kyoto, where China would say, well, it really should be per capita, or even it should be historical. And then rich countries are saying, well, no, we have this legacy, we've built up these fossil fuel intensive economies, and so on. I think people are really far apart on this. Now, we could still end up, so what some of the scenarios that people are looking at, and I'll just run through them very briefly and then finish. One is that countries set up national caps of some kind, and then actually use trade pressure to make sure that other countries start to follow similar kinds of policies. One of the bills, at least one of them before the U.S. Congress right now, sets a cap for U.S. emissions, and then has a provision in there that says any country importing into the United States, if it does not have a comparable policy within 10 years, that the imports of those goods will have to be associated with the purchase of allowances. Now, whether or not all this works with the World Trade Organization and so on, that's a way of richer countries of the world. I mean, we might like to see them, in an equity sense, pay for some of the development, some of the new technologies in developing countries, but I think in the real world it's going to be some combination of a little bit of economic muscle. And so that would be a case in which maybe those countries put in caps. Maybe also there's an initiative now, because of the worries about negotiating a second phase that englobes the rest of the planet, of technology regulations that are applied in certain countries. You can't build starting 5 years from now, you cannot build a coal generating plant without carbon capture and storage to certain specifications. At some point, if I'm in China and I want to export goods to the United States or Europe, I'm going to be given a fair warning, but at some point that kind of technology regulation has to be there as well. So whether this comes in the form of caps or technology-specific regulations, or even, and there is some movement for a global carbon tax of a very modest level that would also be used to transfer funds to developing countries for major new investments, CO2 networks, and so on. I think, again, maybe we're all saying the same thing. It'll be some mixture of these kinds of instruments.
Can I just make one very quick point?
2 seconds.
just to show that Mark and I don't always agree on things. One thing that I will argue very strenuously is that we will never see a world carbon tax. You have to have a governance for taxation, and governments will want to do their own taxation, and they're not going to give some body out there to levy a tax unless they agree to it, which I think is going to be very difficult to do at the international level. If you think carbon trading is difficult to achieve at the international level, neither will an international tax.
And as you pointed out, Quebec has levied a tax, Alberta's levied a tax.
On their own.
Exactly, and that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, well, we can carry on the debate at the next break, but I do need to announce that there is no next break. We're going right to the next panel. But please join me in thanking the panelists from this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.